Well, the greatest joy for me in ministry in the local church was being invited into people's lives during times of celebration and loss. It just always seemed incredible to me that there was the trust and the responsibility to be the church, to be the hands and feet of Christ in those times, and that people wanted it and needed it. And so it was a joy in those times to come together, to depend on the Holy Spirit, and be able to share the love of God. Those were really heightened periods of joy for me in the local church. And then also watching people grow in their discipleship and deepening their faith and going out into the world and taking risks. That was a joyful experience for me to witness. And then in terms of the annual conference, for me, it has just been a great joy to watch this annual conference grow into a wonderfully diverse annual conference and an inclusive annual conference that is going to serve us well as we move into the future seeking to be God's people. That's been a tremendous joy and opportunity to visit with and work with and partner with all the many cultures of our conference.
Joy has many dimensions. Certainly there's the joy of sharing in the meaningful moments of life with people, baptism, birth, death, communion, the high and holy moments. I have been privileged to be pastor to people as they have traveled the journey and have loved the joyous moments. But there's another dimension of joy that's no less significant, and that's the joy of what I would call those spontaneous moments where joy erupts. There's happiness, there's a sense of energy and laughter. I'm thinking of the joy of a well-placed pun that elicits groans and protests, the joy of an idea that becomes a sermon, that becomes a worship theme. I'm thinking of the joy of simply being wild, crazy, zany.
My greatest joy in ministry has always been being a part of God's great movement of grace in the lives of people. I remember when a guy about my age came to me one time and said, Reverend, I'm not a churchgoer, I'm a agnostic, but my daughter wants to come to Sunday school, so I'm going to bring her. Well, that's what he did. He brought her to Sunday school, he sat in church, he listened, asked questions, and one Sunday I had the great honor of baptizing both him and his daughter. And one of the last things I did before I retired is to receive him into the membership of the church. It's great joy. Another time, I had to go across the street from the church to a preschool to pick up a little girl to come to practice for the Christmas pageant practice. Anyway, we got to the corner and she slipped her tiny hand into mine. I kind of melted a little bit and I said, Kalena, it's really good that we hold hands when we cross the street. She looked up and said, well, if you don't hold hands, you're going to get hit by a car. So such wisdom always is something to consider. And actually in ministry, in fellowship, in worship, we all hold hands with the one who gets us across safe and sound and blessed. And in him, I am your brother. Aloha.
Never take your faith journey or that of the people you serve for granted. Sometimes I think we just feel that going through the routines and the life of the church, breathing the same air of tradition and history and meeting together. Just because we do all of those things, our faith somehow gets nurtured in osmosis. But actually, it takes great intentionality. And so you can't take your own faith development for granted, nor that of the people you serve. And the way to do that, to keep on that track, I believe, is to keep an eye on the means of grace, and they will lead you into intentionality.
I think what I would offer is a hope, and the hope that I have is that they will find ways in their own life and career to continually cultivate their passion for their calling, for their profession, for their faith. I remember early on in my ministry a colleague who was pretty jaded and cynical, and I said to myself at that point, I hope I don't become like that. 42 years later, I'm hoping I haven't become like that, but I certainly can understand how it happens. Simply put, I think the institutional pressure that we all experience is one that can sap the life out of a personal faith and a personal passion for Jesus Christ. We can be become so absorbed with meeting the needs of the institution and goals and all of the objectives that we set out for ourselves that it becomes a burden to be born, and we miss our calling. We miss the first love that the writer of Revelation talks about.
Eat more ice cream. It's really hard to stay mad when you're eating ice cream. So, eat more ice cream.
I've been a part of this annual conference for a long time. I grew up here, but I've been on conference staff for a very long time, 26 years. And I am grateful for the trust and the responsibility that's been given to me. I've worked with 4 bishops, more cabinets and volunteer leaders and staff for the conference than I can count. Multiple vision teams, restructure teams, all of which was good, hard work on the part of all the leadership, volunteer and appointed. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for trusting me and for letting us journey together in this work.
I was ordained in 1975, the last annual conference we had in Stockton, and the guest preacher that night was Bishop Kenneth Goodson from the Virginia area. I remember well his message. He looked at our class of ordinands and he said to us, he said, "You young men and women stand before us tonight with your degrees and your diplomas, your intellectual capacity." And he said, "You may be tempted to think that you have earned this moment." And then a long, pregnant pause, and then he thundered, "Nuts to all of that. You're sinners saved by grace." Now that's not necessarily the language that I would have used, but it's the truth that I identified with. I knew in that moment that I was indeed a sinner saved by the grace of God. And so it has been for 42 years. I have experienced that grace.
My thank yous to the annual conference is a long list, almost as long as my no thank you list, but you probably have those two. Maybe both lists are worth something.